Good afternoon, everyone. I am Angelica de Roma, the reporter on other techniques for unpacking curriculum standards and competencies. Specifically, we are going to tackle Bloom's taxonomy and Fink's taxonomy. The 21st century education has become learner-centered, and it requires teachers to conceptualize lessons that are fit into curriculum competencies and as well as diagnose the needs and develop the learners with diverse skills and knowledge at the same time in school. In order to do that, Bloom's taxonomy will help educators to develop critical thinking and higher-order cognitive abilities in students. So, what is Bloom's taxonomy? Bloom's taxonomy is a multi-tiered scale used to express the level of expertise required to achieve each measurable student outcome. In other words, the purpose of this Bloom's taxonomy is to provide teachers a framework or organization for classifying classroom lesson objectives. Teachers can build their lessons through Bloom's taxonomy. Example, as you may have observed, in our previous other subjects, we were taught how to make a detailed lesson plan or semi-detailed lesson plan. And before we can create our activities, it should be anchored in the learning outcomes or objectives. These objectives should be aligned to the curriculum competencies, and the most common way to do that is by referring in Bloom's taxonomy. According to Benjamin Bloom, educational objectives can be categorized in these domains. First is the knowledge base or the cognitive domain. Second is the skills base or the psychomotor domain. And the last one is the affective domain. Let us discuss the first domain, which is the cognitive domain. What is cognitive domain? Cognitive domain involves knowledge and the development of intellectual skills. This includes the recall or recognition of specific facts, procedural patterns, and the concepts that serve in the development of intellectual abilities and skills. The cognitive domain is structured from easy to difficult. From the lower level, which is remember, next is understand, then apply, analyze, evaluate, and the most complex, which is create. So this is the revised version of Bloom's cognitive domain done by Lauren Anderson. Before, there are only 5 levels, making evaluation as the most complex, but Anderson revised it and included the highest level, which is create, honing creative thinking as the most complex form rather than critical thinking, which is honed in the evaluate level. The first level of cognitive domain is remember, which is the lowest level of thinking. We establish here facts and basic concepts among the students, and when creating educational objectives, we can use descriptive verbs such as list, recite, outline, define, name, match, code, recall, identify, label, and recognize. Example: by the end of this lesson, the student will be able to recite Newton's 3 laws of motion. Once the students can recollect facts, we then decide to establish their understanding. Students shall be able to explain ideas or concepts on the second level, which is understand. As teachers, we can use these descriptive verbs on formulating our objectives such as describe, explain, paraphrase, restate, give original examples of, summarize, contrast, interpret, and discuss. For example, by the end of this lesson, the student will be able to describe Newton's 3 laws of motion in his or her own words. On the third level, which is apply, the students shall be able to use their understanding and use these informations in new situations. We can use these descriptive verbs in formulating our objectives such as calculate, predict, apply, solve, illustrate, use, demonstrate, determine, model, perform, and present. For example, by the end of this lesson, the student will be able to calculate the kinetic energy of a projectile. For the next level, which is analyze, we need to develop student skills on drawing connections among ideas. We can use these descriptive verbs such as classify, break down, categorize, analyze, diagram, illustrate, criticize, simplify, and associate to construct our learning objectives. For example, by the end of this lesson, the student will be able to differentiate between potential and kinetic energy. However, on the 5th level, the student should be able to justify a decision or a stand. We can use these descriptive verbs on formulating our learning outcomes such as choose, support, relate, argue, defend, judge, grade, compare, contrast, argue, justify, support, convince, select, and evaluate. For example, by the end of this lesson, the student will be able to determine whether using conservation of energy or conservation of momentum would be more appropriate for solving a dynamics problem. And the last and the most complex and the highest level on the cognitive domain is to create. This requires students to produce new or original work. We can construct our learning outcomes using these descriptive verbs such as design, formulate, build, invent, create, compose, generate, derive, modify, and develop. For example, by the end of this lesson, the student will be able to design an original homework problem dealing with the principle of conservation of energy. It is essential that when teachers create the learning outcomes, they must see to it that it will be effective for all the type of learners where the lesson will be administered. Not all learners have the same intellectual capacity and the degree to process information. Some are advanced learners and some are slow, so see to it that the learning outcomes will fit for every learners of diverse nature. The next domain is the affective domain. So, what is affective domain? Affective domain includes the manner in which we deal with things emotionally, such as feelings, values, appreciation, enthusiasms, motivations, and attitudes. So, this is actually the most complex to measure out of all the domain employed on the students, as the students' response and behavior varies from each other. This is the same with cognitive domain being categorized in a hierarchical level, starting from receiving, responding, valuing, organizing, and lastly, internalizing values or characterization. In the first level of affective domain, which is receiving, the learners are required and willing to be aware of the setting or situation, be attentive, and open to the experience of learning. For example, the learners listen to others with respect, listen for and remember the names of newly introduced people. We can use these illustrative verbs in creating our learning outcomes under affective domain on receiving level, such as ask, choose, describe, follow, give, hold, identify, locate, name, select, sit, erect, reply, and use. Next level is responding. At this level, the learner should be willing to respond, react, participate, and find satisfaction in responding. For example, participates in class discussion, gives a presentation, or questions new ideas, concepts, models, etc. in order to fully understand them. We can use these illustrative verbs such as answer, assist, aid, comply, conform, and etc. in formulating our learning outcomes. The third level is valuing. On this level, the learners are required to behave in a certain way frequently, motivated to invest, and begins to identify with a behavior and commit to it. For example, demonstrate belief in democratic process, is sensitive towards individual and cultural differences, or he or she values diversity, or shows ability to solve problems. We can use these illustrative verbs to construct our learning outcomes such as complete, demonstrate, differentiate, explain, follow, form, initiate, invite, and etc. In this level, the student is not only receiving and responding but should also show value or find and attach value into something. Move on to the next level, which is organizing or organization. At this level, the learners are required to prioritize different values, resolve conflicts, can compare and contrast values and choices, begin to order and prioritize values and chooses to commit to certain values and behaviors. For example, recognizes the need for balance between freedom and responsible behavior, and accept responsibility for one's behavior. We can use these illustrative verbs in constructing our learning outcomes on this level, such as adhere, alter, arrange, combine, compare, complete, defend, explain, formulate, identify, and etc. Lastly, the highest level of affective domain is internalizing values or characterization. At this level, the learner will completely internalize his or her values and behave in accordance, can articulate a philosophy or worldview. In short, letting the learned behavior become a part of you. For example, the student shows self-reliance when working independently, cooperate in group activities or displays teamwork, or revise judgment and changes behavior in light of a new behavior. We can use these illustrative verbs in constructing our learning outcomes such as act, discriminate, display, influence, listen, modify, perform, practice, and etc. Once again, cognitive domain develops students' cognitive abilities, whereas affective domain develops students' behavior and attitudes. Let's proceed on the next domain, which is psychomotor domain or skills-based domain. Psychomotor domain objectives are specific to the ability to use motor skills that includes physical movement, reflex, and coordination to develop techniques in execution, in accuracy, and time. It implies that a physical action supports or is a vehicle for cognitive growth and furthering knowledge or skills. The learner uses physical action to achieve cognitive or affective objectives. For the psychomotor domain, Bloom categorized skill-based learning competencies into 6 categories from simple to complex. The first level on psychomotor domain is perception. Perception is the ability to use sensory cues to guide motor activity. This ranges from sensory stimulation through cue selection to translation. It is the most basic level of being able to process information through the things we see, hear, smell, and respond accordingly. For example, deciding food is safe to eat based on how it smells. We can use these behavioral verbs in constructing our learning outcomes, such as choose, describe, detect, differentiate, distinguish, identify, and select. The next level is set. It is the readiness to act mentally, physically, and spiritually. These are dispositions that predetermine a person's response to different situations, sometimes called mindset. It's about knowing beforehand what to do in a given situation. For example, students know how to follow the procedures and rules of a known game or sport. The behavioral verbs for learning outcomes are begin, display, move, proceed, react, respond, show, and state. Next level is guided response. Guided response describes an early stage of learning when complex tasks are first attempted or mimicked with the guidance of an expert. This typically involves trial and error in the process of incremental improvement. For example, learning how to cook a meal by following a recipe book or video. For behavioral verbs that we can use in constructing our learning outcomes such as copy, react, trace, reproduce, respond, trace, follow, and attempt. Next is mechanism, an intermediate level where learned responses have become habitual and the movements can be performed with some confidence and proficiency. For example, using existing knowledge of language to write an original essay. We can use behavioral verbs such as assemble, construct, dismantle, display, fasten, fix, measure, mix, organize, and sketch to construct our learning outcomes. The next level is complex overt response. This is the expert level where one can consistently perform a task with accuracy. The behavioral verbs are the same with mechanism, but will have adverbs and adjectives that will indicate that the performance is quicker and better. Next is adaptation. On this level, skills are well developed and the individual can modify movement patterns to fit special requirements. For example, responding effectively to unexpected experiences. The behavioral verbs for adaptation are adapt, alter, change, modify, rearrange, reorganize, revise, and vary. Lastly, or the last level on psychomotor domain, which is origination. Origination is creating new movement patterns to fit a particular situation or specific problem. Learning outcomes emphasize creativity based upon highly developed skills, for example, constructing a new theory or creating a new gymnastic routine. Examples of behavioral verbs for origination are arrange, build, combine, compose, construct, create, design, formulate, and etc. Teachers should first decide which of these 3 broad categories, knowledge-based or cognitive domain, skills-based or psychomotor domain, affective domain, are fit for the course goal in order to determine the level of expertise required for each measurable student outcome. This is useful for teachers in understanding the nature of the contents and in the selection of teaching strategies. Organizing measurable student outcomes in this way will also allow teachers to select appropriate class classroom assessment techniques for the course. Now let's proceed on Fink's taxonomy of significant learning. Fink's taxonomy includes foundational knowledge. This includes all the topics and information that you have determined that your students should know by the end of the course. Next is application. This is the critical, creative, and practical thinking skill sets for students, as well as any other skill sets that may be important for your students to use and learn from. After application is integration. This is about connecting different ideas that might be from different disciplines. Following integration is human dimension, which is about students learning more about themselves and bring significance to their learning. Next is caring. This is the focus on creating motivation to learn in your students by developing interest and feelings towards the course material. Finally is learning how to learn. This last area is to provide the ability for students to learn long-term and become self-directed in their own learning. These are all important to keep in mind when designing your course or lesson plan. So that's all for my report this afternoon. Thank you everyone for listening.